There are bad landlords and property managers just as there are bad tenants, but the majority of both rub along nicely. The stories that hit the headlines are the extremes. The new bill seems to be trying to manage the minority to the detriment of the majority. That person's viewpoint. Well, this interview coming up. By the way, the other song that you talked about alongside Something on Abbey Road that George Harrison wrote was Here Comes the Sun.
Oh, yeah.
It's brilliant, isn't it?
It's great.
This interview here has gathered a lot of attention. Many have thought it was satire, but this is all real. Here is an excerpt talking to a reporter and correspondent, Jonathan Swan, to Donald Trump. This clip has had more than 38 million views on Twitter. Here it is.
We're going to look.
Let's look.
And if you look at death...
Started to go up again.
Well, right here, the United States is lowest in numerous categories. We're lower than the world.
Lower than the world?
Lower than
what is that?
Europe.
In what?
Look.
In what?
Take a look. Right here. Here's case death.
Oh, you're doing death as a proportion of cases. I'm talking about death as a proportion of population. That's where the US is really bad. Much worse than South Korea, Germany, etc.
You can't do that.
Why can't I do that?
You have to go by where. Look, here is the United States. You have to go by the cases. The cases.
Why not as a proportion of population?
When we have somebody. What it says is when you have somebody that has it, where there's a case, the people that live from those cases.
It's surely a relevant statistic to say if the US has X population and X percentage of death of that population versus South Korea.
You have to go by the cases.
Well, look at South Korea, for example. 51 million population, 300 deaths. It's like, it's crazy compared to
that.
I do. It's
you
on
don't know that.
You think they're faking their statistics, South Korea?
I won't get into that because I have a very good relationship with the country. But you don't know that. And they have spikes. Look, here's
Germany, low, 9,000.
Here's one right here, United States. You take the number of cases. Now look, we're last, meaning we're first.
Last? I don't know what we're first in. As a what?
Take a look. Again, it's cases. And we have cases... Because of the testing.
1,000 Americans are dying a day, but I understand on cases it's different.
No, but you're not reporting it correctly, Jonathan.
I think I am, but...
If you take a look at this other chart, look, this is our testing, I believe. This is the testing, Yeah,
we do more tests.
No, wait a minute. Well, don't we get credit for that?
You're chuckling away there. It's real.
Yeah, I know.
It's not cut and pasted.
but it's become the norm, though, isn't it? With President Trump.
What do you make of that, Jenny?
Oh God! As soon as he starts talking, my toes start curling. I don't know. I mean, God, it's just appalling.
We return back to that theme of effective political communication in a crisis. And
he denies.
Well, I don't know. I'm not putting a viewpoint on. I'm just asking you guys, on a score of 1 to 10, 10 being highly effective communicator, where would he sit, Chris?
Oh, very low on the scale.
Oh God, negative 5.
Not quite that bad. I was thinking of 1 or 2, but you know.
Okay. All right. Hey, now, email me your transport-related questions. The panel at rnz.co.nz for a transport special 4:30 tomorrow. Chris or Jenny Giblin, thank you very much.
Thank you, Wallace. Thanks for having me.
I really enjoyed it.
Nice to meet you, Jenny.
Yeah, you too, Chris.
Next.
Thanks.
Cheers.
I'm Wallace Chapman. Till tomorrow. See you.
Whakarongo mai koe ki te reo irirangi o Aotearoa. This is Checkpoint on RNZ National. I'm Lisa Owen. E haere aki nei calls from Auckland business leaders to let wealthy students into the country to give the city a financial boost. Simply unbelievable is how some economists describe headline unemployment stats. So what's the real story? Apocalyptic scenes across Beirut after a catastrophic explosion kills dozens and injures thousands. The dark days continue in Victoria with a record 725 COVID cases today and 15 deaths, including a man in his 30s. Meanwhile, Donald Trump has an extraordinary face-off with an Australian reporter over the number of COVID-19 infections in the US. Auckland Airport says it'll be ready for quarantine-free Pacific bubbles from August 17th. RNZ News at 5. Kia ora ko Susana Leata tēnei. The rise in the number of people looking for work is being called staggering. Unemployment dropped to 4% in the 3 months to June, but underemployment jumped to a 16-year high of 12%. A Kiwi Bank economist says the pandemic has slashed the numbers of hours people can work and left them searching for more. Sarah Anson is one of them. She says after losing her job, she's not been able to find full-time work.
It's hell. Okay, I've probably applied for over 200 entry-level reception jobs. So I've had a million rejection letters, which I'm just so sick of getting. I got another one today. I'm working 3 nights a week for a friend in a bar, which is not the dream, but at least it's like some work.
Sarah Anson says it's almost more beneficial for her to do fewer hours and get the benefit on top of her take-home pay. The government is being urged to let international students back into the country and allow universities to run their quarantine facilities. Business leaders gathered for a crisis summit today centred on how to best pull the country's biggest city through the COVID-19 pandemic. Former Prime Minister Sir John Key says international students are crucial for universities and they can handle the quarantine process.
The universities and maybe the schools, but certainly the universities have the capacity to do that. A big financial onus on the universities for making sure they do the job properly. I think maybe they even have to quarantine a little bit longer. The testing regime might be a little bit more strict. There'd obviously be certification from central government and the appropriate authorities at health.
Former Prime Minister Sir John Key. The Director-General of Health says community transmission of COVID-19 is inevitable here, but the Health Minister isn't convinced. Chris Hipkins wasn't even prepared to put a likelihood on a second wave hitting, while Dr Ashley Bloomfield says it's a matter of when, not if, New Zealand gets community transmission. Mr Hipkins says it's more about just being prepared.
That's very speculative. We will do everything we can to keep COVID-19 out, but the Prime Minister and I have both been saying for a long time now that we need to be prepared. We can never take anything for granted. While we'll do everything we can to keep COVID-19 out of New Zealand.
2 cases of COVID-19 were reported today, both in managed isolation. The former Prime Minister Helen Clark is backing a high-level inquiry into the country's response to the COVID-19 outbreak. The recently appointed co-chair of the World Health Organization panel investigating the global response to the pandemic was speaking at an economic summit in Auckland today. She says many countries weren't ready for the outbreak and pandemic preparedness is critical. The former Labour Party leader says convening an inquiry such as a Royal Commission would be a good idea. The minister responsible for managed isolation says there have been 7 reports of security guards stationed at the facilities falling asleep on the job. Megan Wood says the government is taking the report seriously and all of the instances have been investigated. The Lebanese President Lisa Owen has demanded the Cabinet meets today to find out why such a great quantity of a dangerous chemical had for 6 years been stored so close to Beirut city centre. The capital has woken up to scenes of utter devastation following the massive explosion that destroyed much of the port area, killing at least 78 and injuring more than 4,000. Emergency workers are still digging through rubble, searching for survivors after thousands of tonnes of ammonium nitrate exploded at a warehouse. In an address to the nation, the Prime Minister Hassan Diab said those responsible would pay the price. The death toll is expected to rise. It's coming up to 4 minutes past 5. The New Zealand Breakers are preparing to follow in the footsteps of the Warriors and the Wellington Phoenix and spend the entire upcoming Australian NBL basketball season based across the Tasman. The competition is due to start in December, but Australia's ongoing battle with COVID-19 has both the start date and location for matches in doubt. Breakers owner Matt Walsh says there are 3 scenarios for the upcoming season.
1 is us being stationed in Australia for the whole season. 2, us playing all of our home games to start the season and Australian teams coming over if there's a way to make that work. And then 3, the season being delayed and trying to just put it off in time for the bubble to open.
Matt Walsh. Sport New Zealand says allegations of abuse within the gymnastics community should be a warning for other sports to look after athletes. Gymnastics is not the first sport to have been investigated over claims of athlete mistreatment or bullying. The Chief Executive, Peter Miskimen, says while issues of athlete welfare can be difficult for sports to monitor, the New Zealand sports sector needs to do more.
Another wake-up call for many organisations. It is really difficult. It's really complex. It is about about rules and regulations. It's about culture. It's about training and education. It's about reporting. All of those infrastructures and systems need to be there. For some organisations that are all volunteer-run, that's quite challenging and quite daunting.
Peter Miskimen. That's the news.
A huge explosion sends shockwaves across Beirut in Lebanon.
There was an enormous crash, a blinding white flash. This huge amount of pressure came rushing through the apartment. All the doors and windows were ripped off their hinges. The glass throughout the apartment smashed.
The glass just shattered all over the cars around us, the shops, the stores, the buildings.
I was blown back from the door, which is now broken, all around us, people screaming.
Extensive breaking news coverage on Morning Report, weekdays from 6 on air and online.
Now the short forecast from Metsuvis to midnight tomorrow. Northland, a few showers turning to rain tomorrow night. Auckland to Taranaki, also Coromandel, Bay of Plenty and Taupo. Mainly fine tonight, the odd shower about Auckland and Coromandel. Scattered showers tomorrow and late rain in the west. Whanganui and Taihape to Wellington, also Gisborne to Wairarapa. Fine apart from a few cloudy areas. Late showers about Kapiti and Wellington tomorrow. For Nelson, Bulla, Westland and Fiordland, scattered rain developing tonight. Periods of rain tomorrow, heavy at times. Marlborough, fine apart from scattered rain tomorrow evening. Canterbury, North Otago and Dunedin, low cloud about the coast and plains, clearing tomorrow morning. Otherwise fine weather with high cloud tomorrow with scattered rain in the evening. Central Otago, Clutha and Southland, cloudy at times, patchy rain tomorrow. And Chatham Islands, cloudy periods and the odd shower. RNZ National, it's coming up to 7 minutes past 5.
Thanks, Susanna. Welcome to Checkpoint. I'm Lisa Owen. Tonight, headline unemployment figures look good, but what's the reality? And Auckland business leaders say bringing back foreign students would be the economic boost the city needs. But first, dozens of people have been killed and at least 4,000 injured after a massive explosion at Beirut's seaport. There were apocalyptic scenes across the city just after 6 p.m. local time, after thousands of tonnes of ammonium nitrate, which had been stored at a warehouse, exploded, sending a fireball and a thick mushroom cloud into the air. The force of the explosion, which was felt as far away as Cyprus, tore buildings apart and flipped cars into the air, turning the city into what now resembles a war zone. And as Nick Trubridge reports, it's now a race against time in the search for survivors. Now, if you are watching this story, just a warning, some of the images are disturbing.
Horror in Lebanon's capital, Beirut. The aftermath of a catastrophic explosion resembling a war zone. A heavy dust cloud in the air. Cars and buildings torn apart. These pictures shared on social media show an enormous blast at Beirut's port district, sending a ball of white smoke and a fireball into the air, killing dozens of people and injuring thousands of others.
Oh! Bomb exploded in Beirut, like devastation. The whole building fell on top of me. People dying. City destroyed. Just check what I posted. We still don't even know what happened yet.
In the minutes after the explosion, this survivor films dazed and confused people, many of them injured, walking the streets amid the rubble of broken buildings and car parts. Some, like this woman, are badly injured.
What do you need?
Sir, we need our employer.
How can I help you with that?
Sir, look at my feet.
Oh, you need to go to the hospital.
She's covered in blood. Her left leg has a deep, serious shrapnel wound.
Put pressure on it.
Okay.
Put pressure on it. Keep pressing it like it's a big cut.
Further along the road, a city in gridlock as critically injured people are dragged into cars and onto utes in a desperate bid to get to a hospital.
We heard the first explosion and went to see what happened. I didn't have time. I didn't realize there would be a second explosion. The glass exploded in front of me.
We were at home. We heard what sounded like fireworks. We thought it was a container in the port that was on fire and they weren't able to put it out. A few seconds later, we were flying through the air.
Lebanon's Interior Minister said whilst the exact cause was unknown, initial information indicated more than 2,700 tonnes of highly explosive ammonium nitrate stored at the port was responsible for the blast. This man, his face splattered with blood, points to what was his car. It once sat on the road, it's now a shell. The front sits on a concrete wall, the wheels blown off, the glass blown out, cutting his face. The blast was so big it was felt 200 kilometres away. Some residents with memories of heavy shelling during the 1975 to 1990 Civil War thought either an earthquake had struck or a plane had crashed.
I've seen war, I've filmed war. I went to in 2006, I went to the South Lebanon to see this, but it took 30 days to do the same destruction. We had it in one explosion. It is a catastrophe. I've never seen something like that.
Lebanese film director Philippe Araktinji.
I was at home, which is very far away from here, and then I heard a first explosion, something that shook the house, and then a second huge explosion, and I was worried about my kids and my wife.
As night fell across the Lebanese capital, rescuers continued to search for victims in the rubble. Hospitals were overflowing with patients and people searching desperately for loved ones. Prime Minister Hassan Diab is demanding a full investigation into why the explosives were allowed to sit at the port for more than 5 years. For Checkpoint, Nick Trowbridge.
And we'll have more from Beirut after 6 o'clock tonight when we speak to Middle East correspondent for The Independent, Belle True. Official job numbers out today massively understate the reality, according to some economists. The number of unemployed people unexpectedly fell from 4.2 to 4% over lockdown. The Finance Minister, Grant Robertson, says the government's cushioned the blow for businesses and employees by offering the wage subsidy. But the number of people wanting more work soared, and economists say the wage subsidy is simply papering over the cracks, delaying job losses, not stopping them. Charlotte Cook reports.
On the surface, the headline looks good, but dig a bit deeper and the true story is exposed. Unemployment may have dropped slightly, but the revealing thing is the number of people who wanted to work more, but the hours just weren't there. It's called underutilisation. For the 3 months to June, this figure rose from 10.4% to 12%, the largest quarterly rise since 2004. Sarah Anson is one of those people looking for more work. She lost her job in Australia and moved home, and says since returning, she's not been able to get full-time work.
It's hell. Okay, I've probably applied for over 200 entry-level reception jobs. So I've had 1 million rejection letters, which I'm just so sick of getting. I got another one today. I'm working 3 nights a week for a friend in a bar, which is not the dream, but at least it's like some work.
She says it actually works out better for her to have as few hours as possible.
And it's so frustrating because if I work 20 hours a week, I don't get the unemployment benefit or the job seekers benefit. But if I work 10 hours a week, I get paid the same amount as I would for 20 hours because I get half of it from the government. Is it worth going to work for 20 hours a week, or shall I sit at home for the extra 10 hours a week and get paid?
Luke Hempelman also lost his job in promotions and could soon be forced to join the underemployed workforce. He says he's holding out hope for full-time work, but will have to look at part-time options soon.
I've noted in a lot of my searches that there's been a lot of sort of part-time positions or like contract and fixed-term positions advertised. But, I'm obviously hoping for full-time work. I want to get back and I want to keep building my career again, and full-time work is where it's at. So I think if and when my COVID income relief payments run out, I'm going to have to sort of bite the bullet and start looking at those part-time positions.
Economists had predicted a rise in unemployment in the COVID-19 job market, but Stats NZ Senior Manager Sean Broughton says the current data is a bit skewed because of the lockdown.
Unemployment rate was 4% on average over the quarter, but that broadly reflected the definition of unemployment. People have to be actively seeking work. When you've got alert level 4 and 3 restrictions in place, it's a lot more difficult for people to be actively seeking work. And on the flip side of that, you've got businesses that don't necessarily want to recruit that many people.
Kiwibank's chief economist Jared Kerr says the labour market is expected to deteriorate further.
We've seen a drop in employment of 11,000 people, which was lower than most of us thought. The employment rate has come off, but then if you scratch beneath the surface, the hours worked was down 10%, and that's a big decline as you'd expect during this period. But the underutilisation rate, so the level of underemployment, people who have a few hours work but want more, actually increased from 10% to 12%, and that's quite a staggering increase.
Even more staggering, Kiwibank says of the 11,000 people who lost their jobs in the June quarter, 90% were women. The unemployment rate has followed a similar trend for Māori, dropping to 6.7% from 8.7% last quarter. Stats NZ's Andrew Neil says the drop doesn't necessarily make it a good thing, and lockdown again gets some of the blame.
The thing to look at in conjunction with that is that there is also an increase of almost double, or what's that, 14,500 maybe, in Māori who are not in the labour force. Generally people like retired or students, but also those who are not working and could like a job but are not actively trying to find one.
It was previously predicted the Māori unemployment rate would climb as high as 20%. Economists expect the true picture of unemployment will be seen after the wage subsidy stops and businesses have to make some tough decisions. For Checkpoint, Charlotte Cook.
Well, one of a chorus of economists to warn these latest figures do not mean we have dodged a bullet is Kiwibank's chief economist, Jared Kerr, and he joins me now. Kia ora, Jared. I've got your analysis of these figures in front of me today. The title says, Simply Unbelievable. So is the unemployment figure a fiction or is it flawed?
A bit of both, actually. Basically, it's so unbelievable that you just cannot believe what's being put out.
What's wrong with it?
Well, I mean, in order to be deemed unemployed, you have to be actively seeking work, and it's a bit difficult to actively seek work when you're in a lockdown. The Stats Department should have actually looked through this and referred more to the expanded unemployment rate, which they have in their report, and that was 4.6%, but it was actually trending higher and at 4.9% by the end of the quarter. And I think that gives a bit more of an accurate reflection of what's happening. It's a move from 4.2 towards 5. We were forecasting 5.2, and this is just the start. So we really need to see what happens after the wage subsidies stop, and that's where I think most of us are forecasting another leg higher in the unemployment rate towards 9%.
One of the banks is saying that it should be disregarded, this figure. Do you agree? Is it not worth the paper it's written on?
No, completely disregard it and look at the other stats within the report. So the underutilisation rate, I think, gives you a better idea. That rose from a little over 10% to 12%. That tells you that the number of people who are underemployed increased. So you may have a job earning 10, 15 hours worth of work a week, but you actually want 30, 40 hours work. And the anecdotes that you showed on your show just before, I think, reflect that nicely.
So what role has the wage subsidy played here?
I think it's played a very good role of putting a Band-Aid over a pretty nasty wound. But when we rip that Band-Aid off, we'll get a better feel as to how that wound has healed. And there'll be some big decisions being made by employers as to whether they can keep these employees on after that subsidy is finished. And I think that is when the true test comes, and that is when we will find out exactly, how many people have been displaced on the back of the lockdowns.
Jared, are you expecting that to be relatively immediate?
Yes. What's unusual about this whole COVID-19 lockdown is that everything was immediate. We went straight into lockdown, then we came straight out of lockdown, and a lot of the economy's gone back to how it was quite quickly, a lot faster than we thought. So it's generally a good news story. But then there are parts, within tourism and hospitality who are sort of holding on by a thread, and part of that thread is the wage subsidy. So I think once that stops, I think a lot of these companies will just have to do what they have to do, and there's downsize. and that's when we'll see, a lot of these workers coming into the market looking for other jobs.
I just want to read you something that was written today. It says the unemployment numbers show the robustness of the economy. New Zealanders will notice in their communities that the economy is back up and running. Do you agree with that? Did this figure show the robustness of the economy?
No, it doesn't, and I do not believe in that statement. If you actually go through the report in some detail, you'll see that there's a lot of slack that's developing beneath the surface. As I said, with that rise in underutilisation rates, the decline in the employment rate, the fact that hours worked was down 10% on the quarter. I mean, that was a huge drop. And hourly earnings was also quite soft, and that was pushed higher by the minimum wage hike being forced through in April. So, there is a lot of weakness beneath the surface, and we are by no means out of this. And I think the next two employment reports will be critical.
That was actually written by Grant Robertson. It was in the Finance Minister's press release today. So do you think he's looking at it with rose-tinted glasses?
Well, I'd like to see what else he's written about us. I'm sure he wrote more than just that. But to look at the unemployment rate alone and say that, we've actually strengthened as a labour market because it's gone from 4.2 to 4, I think is wrong. I think that's a spurious read.
What do we need here then? So there's no sign that the wage subsidy is going to be continued. You say that the sugar hit from immediate spending after the lockdown, well, that's going to wear off. So what do we need here? What's the shot in the arm?
We really need to look at where these jobs have been lost, and we all know roughly where they're coming from. It's just tourism and services and hospitality, and start thinking about how we repurpose these jobs and how we retrain these people into other areas. The simple answer so far has been, well, people that are displaced from Queenstown, for example, could just pick up a spade and start digging a road somewhere. The problem with that is that the jobs that have been lost are actually predominantly women's jobs, and the jobs that we're trying to stimulate are actually predominantly men's jobs. So we're trying to stimulate construction, which is sort of 70-80% men, and what we're losing is hospitality jobs, which is, I think, 60-70% women. And in the report, what I found staggering was of the 11,000 decline in employment, 10,000, so 90%, were women over the quarter losing their jobs.
So should the government be targeting any assistance to female-dominated industries?
Absolutely. Yep, you deal with the problem at hand, and that problem has showed itself. We flagged it as a risk earlier in the year because we looked at what industries would most likely be impacted by extended lockdowns and border closures. And, we sort of realised that 60-70% of those jobs were, female-dominated jobs, and there needs to be a focus on getting women into other industries, trying to get them into construction, obviously, but also trying to find other roles in our economy.
Good to talk to you. That is Kiwi Bank's Chief Economist Jared Kerr there. Now, Checkpoint did request an interview with the Finance Minister, Grant Robertson. He declined. It is 23 minutes past 5 and you're with Checkpoint on RNZ National. We're keen for your feedback on that. If you're in the job market, do let us know how it's going. Can you get the job that you want or the hours that you need? You can text us on 2101, tweet us at Checkpoint RNZ or email checkpoint@rnz.co.nz. Auckland business leaders want the government to let wealthy international students back into the country via quarantine facilities run by universities. Speaking at a crisis summit today, Mayor Phil Goff, Sir John Key and Rob Fife all signalled the need to expand quarantine facilities to make the most of New Zealand's COVID-free status, while also letting in the right people to keep New Zealand's economy afloat. Our cameraman Nick Monroe and reporter Nita Blake-Person were at the summit.
As 200 people packed into this Auckland hotel with no face masks or social distancing, you'd be forgiven for thinking COVID-19 was a thing of the past. But not quite.
We have a financial crisis that's coming, not a health crisis.
Former Prime Minister Sir John Key warning a significant contraction of the economy is coming, with the country's economic hub at the sharp end.
We are the engine room of growth. So if Auckland slows down, the rest of the country slows down.
Mayor Phil Goff says some forecasts estimate 50,000 Aucklanders will be out of work by the end of the year. And here's why.
53% of the $7.8 billion of tourist spend in our city coming from international visitors. We're the centre of international education in New Zealand, and the international students are worth $2.8 billion to our local economy, and that will be heavily impacted as the flow of new students dries up. Many of our big infrastructure projects, the City Rail Link and the Central Interceptor, rely on the availability of highly skilled international workers. If they were not to be able to come here, those projects would grind to a halt.
But in crisis, there's opportunity. Mr Goff suggesting softening border restrictions is where that opportunity lies.
Core workers can be given entry, subject to strict quarantine requirements, organised and paid for by the companies employing them rather than the taxpayer. We at Council have submitted to Government a proposal to pilot the screening of high-value international students at Auckland University who can be quarantined in student hostels with a 24/7 monitoring regime in place, again on a user-pays basis.
That message echoed by Sir John Key.
We can turn that tap back on quite successfully. I'm not arguing at all that we should challenge that we don't want community transmission. We clearly don't. But in the same way that we welcome New Zealanders who are returning from overseas and appropriately put them in quarantine and test them for 14 days, the universities and maybe the schools, but certainly the universities have the capacity to do that. A big financial onus on the universities for making sure they do the job properly. I think you might maybe they even have to quarantine a little bit longer. The testing regime might be a little bit more strict. There'd obviously be certification from central government and the appropriate authorities at health, but they do have big facilities actually to house students in quarantine, and why wouldn't you start at least with the trials, start with a couple of hundred students and go from there as you build your confidence levels.
Former Air New Zealand boss Rob Fyfe, who was part of the government's COVID-19 response team, supportive in principle.
I would hope that we're able to start seeing a significant expansion of our quarantine capacity early in the new year. I think this side of Christmas there's some things we can do, but it's a little bit more limited. But we should do the planning now, and I think the critical issue is we can't wait till after the election or wait till the new year to start planning these things. It takes time, as you've identified. So we've got 3 or 6 months while everyone's out there electioneering that we could be building and planning for this infrastructure in the interim.
But he says international students won't necessarily be the first cab off the rank.
I've been bombarded with requests from people wanting to understand how they can get into the country. I think international students are a very valuable resource. I think there's some critical skills we need in the construction sector to support some of the infrastructure spend that we really need to be doing. There's other businesses that have essential technical workers that need to come in. So I think it'd be great to do a scan across all the demands that are out there and start prioritising, figuring out the scale of the demand, figure out what we need to build, figure out who we prioritise in first. And government can do that if there's a mandate to say we want to solve this problem.
Last month, the government threw the international education sector a $51 million lifeline, warning providers that overseas students aren't likely to return before the end of the year. I Tamaki Makoto, mo te hōtaka o te ahi nei, ko Nita Blake Person aho.
To the US now, and President Trump has dismissed America's record number of COVID-19 infections and deaths as it is what it is. The US leads the world in cases and deaths, 4.7 million cases and 156,000 deaths. But in a startling interview with AXOS reporter Jonathan Swan, the president maintains he has the crisis under control. CNN's Caitlin Collins has the story.
Even though his own health experts are warning that the U.S. has entered a worrisome new phase of the pandemic, President Trump is insisting it's under control.
Here's one right here, United States. You take the number of cases. Now look, we're last.
meaning we're first.
In a new interview with Axios, the president is eager to declare victory and leans on the mortality rate as an indication that things are improving.
Death is way down from where it was.
Despite how more than 1,000 Americans have died on average per day for the last week straight, the president stuck to his talking point.
Right here, the United States is lowest in numerous categories. We're lower than the world.
Lower than the world?
Lower than
what is that?
Europe.
In what?
Look,
in what?
Take a look. Right here. Here's case death.
Oh, you're doing death as a proportion of cases. I'm talking about death as a proportion of population. That's where the US is really bad. Much worse than South Korea, Germany, etc.
You can't do that.
He also claimed once again that there are more cases in the US because there is more testing, though health officials say it's because the virus is spreading.
There are those that say you can test too much. You do know that.
Who says that?
Oh, just read the manuals, read the books.
Manuals?
Read the
What
books.
manuals?
Read the books.
What books?
Trump also defended putting thousands of his supporters indoors without requiring masks or social distancing during his attempt to return to the campaign trail 6 weeks ago in Tulsa.
Well, because that area was a very good area at the time. It was an area that was pretty much over. After a month later, it started going up. That's a month later.
Trump argued that he canceled another planned rally in New Hampshire out of concern for public health.
And I canceled another one. I had to cancel it. We're going to have a great crowd in New Hampshire, and I canceled it for the same reason.
But his own staff told reporters that it was only postponed because of bad weather and that it would be rescheduled. It never was.
And that was CNN's Caitlin Collins with that report. And coming up on Checkpoint on RNZ National, a man in his 30s is among Victoria's COVID-19 toll as the state reports a record 725 new infections and 15 deaths. Auckland Airport says it will have the facilities ready to process quarantine-free travellers by August 17 if the government gives the green light. And from a crisis summit to a fizz summit, the Wellington school kids on a crusade to ban sugary drinks. We would love your feedback on anything you've heard on the program this evening, especially those unemployment statistics and what it's really like in the job market if you are out there looking for work or extra hours. Do text us 2101 or tweet us at Checkpoint RNZ. Email address is checkpoint@rnz.co.nz. Time to get to the headlines with Susanna now.
A woman who lost her job due to the pandemic says she's unsuccessfully applied for more than 200 entry-level jobs and still can't find full-time work. It comes as figures show unemployment dropped to 4% in the 3 months to June, but underemployment jumped to a 16-year high of 12%. Kiwi Bank's chief economist says the unemployment numbers are unbelievable and should be disregarded because the lockdown prevented people from actively looking for work. Jared Kerr told Checkpoint the wage subsidy has also acted like a band-aid, and once that ends, the figures will be more realistic. Emergency workers in Beirut are still digging through rubble, searching for survivors after thousands of tonnes of ammonium nitrate exploded at a warehouse, killing dozens and injuring more than 4,000. The Lebanese President Lisa Owen has demanded the cabinet meet today to find out why such a large quantity of a dangerous chemical had for 6 years been stored so close to the capital's city centre. Auckland business leaders have called on the government to make the most of New Zealand's COVID-free status to attract high-level people back into the country. Proposals at today's crisis summit included international students being allowed back in and for universities to be able to run their own quarantine facilities. The minister responsible for managed isolation says there have been 7 reports of security guards stationed at the facilities falling asleep on the job. Megan Wood says the government is taking the report seriously and all of the instances have been investigated. All Milford workers and residents are being encouraged to get tested for COVID-19 after a traveller who visited the area later tested positive in South Korea. A free pop-up surveillance testing site will be held at the Milford Sound Fire Station between 8 a.m. and 3:30 p.m. tomorrow. The Health Minister has hit back at a suggestion from the Director-General of Health that community transmission of the coronavirus is inevitable in New Zealand. Chris Hipkins says called that very speculative and says the government will do everything it can to keep the virus out. Those are the latest news headlines from RNZ National. Our next news and weather update is at 6.
Thanks, Susanna, and kia ora anō. This is Checkpoint. I'm Lisa Owen. It's time to go to the business news with Nicholas Poynton. Nicholas, Consumer New Zealand wants the Commerce Commission to use its powers to investigate the supermarket industry. So first off, lots of consumers in there. The consumer, being the advocacy group, wants the government watchdog to have a snoop around the supermarket industry.
Consumer New Zealand. So like that big study we saw into the retail fuel price that was conducted by the Commerce Commission, Consumer New Zealand wants a similar investigation into supermarkets. At the moment, we've got two major players, that is Progressives and Foodstuffs. And Consumer New Zealand, that's the advocacy group, they believe that the current setup isn't really delivering the result, isn't really meeting the needs of everyday consumers. And one of the examples it uses is that there tends to be so many specials on the same products all the time. And they say it raises the question that, are these discounts actually real? Are you actually paying for, when you're buying something on special, are you actually just paying the price it should be at all the time? And they use this specific example. They say they found at one particular New World, a loaf of Vogel's, a loaf of Ploughman's bakery bread, a loaf of Nature's fresh loaves were on special for 11 out of 12 weeks.
Right. So they're basically saying, as you've put it, that that's the normal price you would pay. So they're not actually offering you a deal. They're just putting a sign up that makes you feel like you're getting a deal.
Exactly. So that's what Consumer New Zealand, that's what they want the Commerce Commission to actually have a look at and begin to investigate. But there has already been some pushback. Business New Zealand says that any investigation has to meet a high threshold of concern, and they're hinting that at the moment there isn't much of a high threshold. They also say that a big investigation like this, it's expensive, it's extensive, and they say that generally it doesn't actually meet the needs of consumers.
Hey, that's interesting. Just while you're talking, hold that thought. I reckon lots of listeners will have something to say about this. So 2101 on the text. Let us know if you think that the supermarkets need to be investigated, because they're basically telling us that there isn't a need for this kind of investigation.
Yeah, so just going back to what Business New Zealand is saying, they say that, look, if the Commerce Commission wants to look into this, the first step they could take is just simply request information from the supermarkets. But like you're saying, I was going to suggest the same thing, that listeners would be interested to hear what they have to say, because I wonder if people, when they're in the supermarket, they ever scratch their heads and think, wait, I saw this on sale the last week, or this was on sale 2 weeks ago, you know what I mean? So it would be interesting to see what people are saying, to see if there is actually going to be any traction here for what Consumer New Zealand, the advocacy group, is actually calling for.
Yeah, side issue, but kind of related. We're trying to cut down on food waste as well, and a lot of specials are tagged to you buying more than one of an item and fresh food. So I think that's an interesting dilemma as well. Okay, gold. One of our favourite topics, Nicholas. So gold is what, worth more and more?
Yeah, look, I've been waiting to talk about this properly for a while now, and I've been mentioning a lot on the show, because there has been a precipitous rise in the value of gold since the pandemic first hit. For the year to date, the price of gold is actually up by 32%. It's really an unprecedented rise. And the main driver of this, the chief driver really, is that gold has always been considered a safe haven asset. And given the uncertainty the world over, it shouldn't really come as too much as a surprise, because if you survey the landscape at the moment, interest rates, they're as low as they've ever been. So if you've got your money in the bank, you're not getting too much of a return. A lot of central banks around the world, they're engaged in rampant quantitative easing, that, printing of money, that's leading to maybe a devaluing of currency, so people are losing some faith there. And also look at the markets, they've been incredibly volatile. We've seen stocks go up without, none of it's really making sense for a lot of people who make a living trying to pick this. So for the people who do invest in gold, they're feeling very assured by the fact that their money, their wealth is tied up in something that's pretty stable, and more importantly, it's actually something that's tangible. You can actually hold it. That's part of the appeal here. That's part of its safe havenness, I guess. And so I guess the question is, how high will gold continue to rise? And I've seen some figures quoted maybe in the realm of $2,300 an ounce, but a lot of these figures are coming from gold brokers, so you've got to take anything they're saying with a grain of salt, because of course they're going to talk up the price of gold because they want you to buy more. And I know with that, I'm kind of at risk now of sounding like this has been a kind of an advertisement for gold. So I should caution that like any asset, it will fluctuate in price. It's not immune to the risks of any other investment. And I've even seen one commentator compared the soaring price of gold to the Bitcoin bubble. And we all saw how that ended. So if you are thinking about investing in gold, please do your due diligence, consult independent, advice, and, before you decide to make a decision.
I'd love to know who's pocketing great wads of gold.
Well, apparently New Zealanders.
Yeah,
I spoke to a gold
who?
broker the other day, says New Zealanders have been flocking to buy this. At one point, they didn't even have enough gold to meet the demand.
Okay, dig some more on it, Nicholas, and give us an update. Okay, what's been happening on the market today?
So NZX is down a touch by 14 points to 11,757. The New Zealand dollar is up by a third to 66.4 US cents, steady at 92.4 Australian, and unchanged at 50.7 British pence. And gold, last time I checked, sitting at $2,023 US an ounce.
Thanks, Nicholas. That's Nicholas Poynton with our business news. So do get in touch with your thoughts on whether there needs to be an investigation into supermarkets and pricing there. 2101 on the text, or you can tweet us at Checkpoint RNZ. It's Victoria's deadliest day in the battle against COVID-19, with 725 new cases and 15 more deaths, including a man in his 30s. It comes as the state prepares for 250,000 workers to stay home and their school children to go back to online classes. And as Alex Perrottet reports, there are concerns for those children coping with yet another lockdown, and grief for those who are dying in embattled aged care homes.
Premier Daniel Andrews used the tragic news of Australia's youngest COVID-19 victim to send a grim warning.
This is a virus that affects everyone. We're terribly saddened by this, but hopefully no one misses that point, that this is something that's not just of those who are frail and aged. It can be deadly, and it has been deadly here and around the world in people of all age groups, and indeed people that are in otherwise good health.
But the bulk of fatalities are in aged care, including 12 of today's 15 deaths. The Premier has put the spike of recorded cases in aged care today down to a sharp increase in tests.
There's obviously a lot of testing going on in aged care at the moment, not just residents. That number includes staff also. You would describe it as challenging, very, very challenging setting, but there has been some stability come to it.
He said some elderly residents will need to be moved at certain risk to their mental well-being, but in the greater interests of managing the pandemic. School and childcare is suspended unless parents are essential workers. Most elective surgeries have also been cancelled. The Federal Education Minister Dan Tehan today announced extra help for childcare and early childhood education centres so they can keep children enrolled over the next 6 weeks and ensure families don't lose their places.
These are very trying times for all Victorians, very challenging times for all Victorians. But my focus is very much on making sure that I'm playing my role as part of the federal government to be there to assist.
And after criticism of the state's contact tracing process, Mr Tehan said it was vital to get on top of it.
We do have to make sure that we've got the testing turnaround times as quickly as we possibly can. We've got to make sure that the contact tracing is being done as quickly as we possibly can. And that's why we've got the ADF now in assisting the Department of Health and Human Services in Victoria.
He says over 10% of the nation's Defence Force members are in Victoria, helping the Health Department. Mother of 8, Katie Lee, lives just across the New South Wales border in Albury, but her 2 oldest children attend the University of Melbourne. They've now moved back home, and Katie says it's a testing time for them all.
When they're getting frightened or concerned, or they think lots of people are dying and that's all they're taking away, we need to have a discussion about that. So it's a little bit tricky sometimes trying to get across the information which I need as a mother and my husband needs as well, and we all need as a family, and also letting the younger children, understand what's really going on.
And leaders of nearby states are getting more and more concerned. This morning, Queensland completely shut the border to New South Wales and the ACT. New South Wales has announced it will impose a 14-day quarantine on anyone entering the state from Victoria, even with permits, unless they're entering border communities like Albury. And they will have to pay.
There should be no difference from a New South Wales citizen coming back from an overseas destination in terms of the costs they're having to pay versus the cost of returning travellers from Victoria. Of course, there are always exceptions to hardship if people can't afford to pay, but we will consider those.
New South Wales Health has reported 12 new confirmed cases today, with one case locally acquired with no known source. The New South Wales Chief Health Officer has told the public to consider making small changes to their lives, such as not going to 3 hotels in one night or limit themselves to one night out a week, a far less onerous task than what's being enforced just south of the border. For Checkpoint, Alex Perrottet.
It'll take a minimum of 6 weeks in hard lockdown for the Australian state of Victoria to claw back control of its COVID outbreak. And even then, it will be a massive task, according to an epidemiologist and World Health Organisation advisor. Professor Mary Louise McLaws is an epidemiologist at the University of New South Wales and is an advisor to the World Health Organisation, their expert panel for COVID-19. She says the record 725 cases in Victoria today are part of a long, high, stubborn peak.
That's a lot of cases, and when you add them over a 2-week period, because that's double the incubation period, to get an idea of how well they're handling at this and whether or not they're getting anywhere near containment, they're up to 6,080, and it's an enormous task because every one of those 400 odd yesterday and potentially 700 today, they each have a number of contacts every day of at least up to 10 people. And if they're younger, they'll have more contacts. And looking at the breakdown by age, in Melbourne, they have 35% of all cases are 20-year-olds to 34-year-olds. So they fulfill either a great social connection, lots of people, and they also are potentially underemployed and are casually employed across several work areas, which means that if they are infectious, a couple of days before they start showing symptoms, if they're not keeping their mask on all day long at work, in the lunchroom, in the bathroom, everywhere, and keeping their hands from contaminating high-touch surfaces, it's going to be very difficult.
Looking at those numbers, how far off the peak do you think they are?
Well, I've been tracking their numbers and plotting it for a 2-week period, and they looked as if they were hitting their peak in towards late July. Then they dropped, then they went up again. And it's all about getting people to be tested, putting more clinics in place. Of course, you do have to wait a couple of days for the results to come through because just in July alone, I think they were doing something like 700,000 tests. To get those through all of the laboratories in Melbourne is a very, very big task. So they may be a couple of days behind. And of course, usually in an outbreak, you plot the day of onset of illness, but we're plotting the date of diagnosis of the cases coming through the lab. So if there's a delay, then there'll be a bit of a spike or a bit of a trough while they're waiting for the cases. So they went up dramatically at about the end of the first week of July, and they've stayed at a very high level since then, and it's been stubbornly high. I do think that everybody needs to be told if they've had any exposure and they don't have any symptoms, they still need to stay at home, because we know that 100% of cases can be infectious a couple of days before they become symptomatic. And 18%, that's what we've estimated. I was in a group looking at a meta-analysis. 18% remain asymptomatic the whole way through their illness. And then the rest of them, the 82%, are pre-symptomatic but potentially excreting virus a couple of days before they start getting sick, overtly ill. So You have to stay at home because you can't keep up your personal hygiene if you're excreting and you touch your face, you touch your eyes, you touch your nose. You've got to put the lid down on the toilet because you can excrete it, not in big numbers, but in your feces, and that can aerosolize. There are whole lots of reasons why it's very difficult to contain it outside the home in a crowded workplace.
So, given all of the factors that you have outlined and the numbers that we're still seeing from Victoria, how much can a lockdown achieve this late in the piece?
It will achieve its goals. It will just take many weeks.
Do you know how many, Professor? What do you estimate?
Well, I'd estimate at least a good 6 weeks. An increase in numbers always happens fast, but trying to get it down always happens slowly, and it's because we're always behind in the data.
If we look at New South Wales, how does that state avoid ending up in the same strife that Victoria's in?
Wear a mask immediately in public. Now, the numbers don't look big. The numbers look very containable. However, they certainly did for Victoria as well.
And that was Professor Mary Louise McLaws, who is an epidemiologist at the University of New South Wales. It is 10 minutes to 6. I'm Lisa Owen and you're with Checkpoint on RNZ National. A lot of you are getting in touch about the unemployment figures out today, but also about talk of letting foreign students back into the country and our border controls. Gary says no one should be entering the country until all countries have the virus eliminated or minimal numbers. Someone else has got in touch to say private-run quarantine is a pathway to a disaster. Most New Zealanders would only allow students into New Zealand if such facilities were run by the police. And Graham says the economy must come second to keeping New Zealand COVID-free. Universities are not set up to control quarantined students. Thanks for your feedback. Do keep it coming. You can text us on 2101, tweet us at Checkpoint RNZ or email checkpoint@rnz.co.nz. Auckland Airport says it will be ready to operate facilities for a quarantine-free Pacific bubble by August 17 if given the green light. It comes as the government is being challenged to present a proactive border opening strategy to free up trade and travel with our Pacific neighbours. The Pacific Business Council with the Foreign and Trade officers hosted a webinar earlier today to generate recommendations that will help accelerate the launch of a Pacific bubble. And as Dominic Godfrey reports, Auckland Airport is ready to go.
The Pacific Business Council Chair, Peter McGill, made his intentions clear from the outset.
From this morning's discussions, we will use our findings to lobby the New Zealand Government, including Winston Peters, who we currently have an open dialogue with regarding to accelerating the opening of Pacific borders.
Realm countries Cook Islands, Niue and Tokelau remain COVID-19 free, as do the Samoas, Solomon Islands, Tonga and Vanuatu, while others, including Fiji, have halted community transmission. Investment Fiji's chief, Craig Strong, made it clear how important it was for his country of 800,000, where tourism accounts for 40% of GDP, and most of which has effectively disappeared.
Currently, we have around 110,000 Fijians who have lost their jobs or on reduced working hours. So we are projecting remittances to fall by some 15%. And at the end, we are projecting the largest single economic contraction in Fijian history to be around 21.7%.
He says a travel bubble is critical for Fiji's short-term recovery and detailed how tourism infrastructure could operate within a safe and secure quarantined bubble. Auckland Airport's Network Development Manager Mick Cottrell says a safe travel zone is doable and they can maintain total separation of passengers from COVID-free Pacific countries and those arriving into quarantine.
We've actually petitioned off our whole PRA with 10 gates, which will be exclusively for quarantine-free travel.
Mr Cottrell says Auckland Airport has advised government that they will be ready by 17 August for unlimited travel with quarantine-free countries.
In 14 days' time, if we got a flight from Rarotonga, it would have a whole pier of the airport to itself, and it will have 10 aerobridges to pull up at.
The Cook Islands Chamber of Commerce President Fletcher Melvin notes that tourism accounted for 85% of GDP and businesses had seen a 90% drop in trade since March. He says government wage subsidies end in September, so a safe travel corridor with New Zealand is essential, particularly now they've mitigated risk to their own community.
We've been preparing for the last 3 months to ensure that when we do open up, our health system is robust. And we are very fortunate that our head of health is an epidemiologist, and he has been leading from the front and ensuring that we are ready on our end when it comes to health protocols.
Mr Melvin cites a rocky outlook for his country with a predicted 3-year recovery period and says what gives them hope is the opening of a safe travel corridor with New Zealand. He says there's no reason this can't happen before the election. Attendees agreed it's time to safely open borders with realm countries Niue and Cook Islands, followed by other COVID-free parts of the Pacific. Australia will not be considered whilst there's still community transmission. The Pacific Business Council will present its recommendations to government. Mo te hōtaka o te ahiahi, ko Dominic Godfrey tēnei.
Sugary drinks are fizzer, while a group of primary students from Porirua think so. For more than 20 years, sugary drinks have been banned at Glenview School, and students there say it's given their education and lives a big boost. Today they travelled into Wellington to tell politicians they want the government to ban sugary drinks at all schools in New Zealand. Our reporter Logan Church and cameraman Samuel Rillstone joined them at the Fizz Summit.
A class of 10 and 11-year-olds may not be your typical lobby group, but today their message is simple. They want sugary drinks out and water run. 10-year-old Joe Taniel and 11-year-old Taloi Talei say they want the government to introduce a nationwide ban.
We're going to try convince the government to help the children at school so they will drink more water.
Water really helps your brain to function while you're learning.
At the moment, it's up to schools and their boards of trustees if they want to ban sugary drinks. Glenview School became water only more than 25 years ago.
Sugar in schools doesn't really help your brain to function properly while you're learning, so it's better if we drink water because it helps your body.
Today, these students are at the Fizz Summit, held in a small church hall in the shadow of Parliament. They're here to talk about how being sugary drinks free has helped them and why they think politicians should introduce the same rules nationwide. And here to listen is the Greens Minister for Women and Associate Health Minister Julianne Genter, National's Health Spokesperson Dr Shane Adeti, and TOP's Hut Self-candidate Dr Ben Wiley Van Eerd. Questions to the pupils came thick and fast, including what do their parents think about their school being water only.
They think it's good because, you won't, because, you'll be healthier longer. If your parents know that you're healthy, they won't be worried that much about you.
And what about their older siblings?
My big sister doesn't like it because she's used to eating a lot of junk food. My sister's alright with it, but she knows it's unhealthy, so she normally drinks iced tea instead. My sisters and my brothers, they don't like drinking fizzies or eating sugar. They like drinking water and milk.
The students handed over policy briefs to the politicians present. So what do they think? National's Dr Shane Adeti says he supports schools being sugar-free, but National wouldn't make it compulsory.
No, we believe parents and teachers make the best decisions, and so we'll back them with information. This is a call for schools and Board of Trustees, but we're indicating our intention that it's a good thing.
The Greens' Julianne Genter is all for sugar-free.
So far there's been good uptake. We'd like to resource it better and see if the sector wants us to go further. We can look at mandating it.
As well as TOP's Dr Ben Wiley Van Eerd.
On the strength of what's been shown today, we're quite happy to support the idea of a water-only schools initiative.
Outside school gates in Wellington, parents on the school run were mixed about the idea of a nationwide school ban on sugary drinks. Sugary drinks in schools?
No.
Why is that?
They don't need it.
Well, I think some kids like them sometimes. So if it is given in moderation, it should be all right. So maybe not every day a week, but as and when they want it, they could drink it. But instead of just banning it completely.
Not at all.
Why is that?
Just really easy to get rid of them. They're so bad for you. Just a simple step. Stop them coming in at the outset.
While it's back to school for these Glenview school kids, the challenge they've laid down is clear. No more sugary drinks. For Checkpoint, Logan Church.
And if you were listening to that on radio, we will put the video up online and you can see those amazing smart kids making their presentation. Getting a lot of feedback from you about the job stats today, which indicated that unemployment had dropped over the COVID lockdown, went from 4.2% to 4%, but a lot of economists say it's not worth the paper it was written on because of the methodology. Mandy has got in touch. She says, I'm single, 51-year-old woman without a job, I'm looking in relationship management, sales administration roles and finding it very tricky to get in the door for an interview. I'm not just competing with others without work and looking, I'm also competing with those who are in work and want to move up away from their current positions. So I'm not dealing with 150 other out-of-work applicants. I'm competing with those looking to change their jobs too. I've taken a mortgage suspension, but that will run out at the end of September. I am holding out that I will find something soon. Another listener says, I'm a 50-year-old woman and terrified. It is refreshing to hear an honest discussion of gender employment issues from a bank economist. Nita says to work 20 hours a week at a bar job and to be connected to others is far, far better than working 10 hours and sitting 10 extra at home. Believe me, it is soul-destroying. Another listener says it's been even more difficult for well-qualified immigrants like myself. I've been unemployed for 8 months after being made redundant in December. Luckily, my wife works full-time, but we are scraping by.
RNZ News at 6, ngā mihi nui ko Susana Leata tēnei. The latest unemployment figure is being dismissed as not worth the paper it's written on. It dropped slightly to 4% for the 3 months to the end of June, defying predictions the pandemic would have seen it jump. But underemployment has risen to a 16-year high of 12%. Kiwi Bank's chief economist Jared Kerr says that's the more important figure.
I mean, in order to be deemed unemployed, you have to be actively seeking work, and it's a bit difficult to actively seek work when you're in a lockdown. The Stats Department should have actually looked through this and referred more to the expanded unemployment rate, which they have in their report, and that was 4.6%.
Jared Kerr from Kiwi Bank. The death toll from a massive explosion that rocked Beirut has reached 100, and the Lebanese Red Cross says more victims are under the rubble. Smoke is still rising from the remains of buildings damaged by the force of the blast, the BBC's Rami Ruhiem reports.
Late into the night, official consensus began to form on what it was exactly that blew up in the port of Beirut. 2,750 tons of ammonium nitrate, said the Prime Minister at a meeting of the Supreme Defence Council. He added it was unacceptable that it had been sitting there in a warehouse for 6 years without safety precautions. The story of how that happened will be the focus of many seeking justice, and the authorities have vowed to hold those responsible to account.
Rami Ruhiem reporting. Former Prime Minister Helen Clark is backing a high-level inquiry into New Zealand's response to the COVID-19 outbreak. The recently appointed co-chair of the World Health Organization panel investigating the global response to the pandemic was speaking at an economic summit in Auckland today. She says many countries weren't ready for the outbreak and pandemic preparedness is critical.
I definitely think that a full reflection, whether it's a Royal Commission or a Commission of Inquiry or an expert panel, whatever, would be a good idea.
The Auckland Tourism Events and Economic Development Agency is predicting as many as 50,000 people could end up out of work as the economy takes a hit from the pandemic. An epidemiologist is warning it will take several weeks for Victoria to start seeing a downward trend in coronavirus cases and deaths. Professor Mary Louise McClaws is an epidemiologist at the University of New South Wales and is a member of the WHO's Health Emergencies Expert Advisory Panel for COVID-19. She told Checkpoint Victoria is in for the long haul.
Well, I'd estimate at least a good 6 weeks. An increase in numbers always happens fast, but trying to get it down always happens slowly, and it's because we're always behind in the data.
New Zealand had 2 new cases today, both in managed isolation. A Wellington leather shop's name mishap has been described as easily avoidable. The store owners named it Huru Huru, thinking it was a translation of hair or wool, but it can be also translated to pubic hair. Te reo exponent Te Hāmua Nikora made that known in a Facebook video. An AUT lecturer, Hemi Kelly, says some companies are incorporating te reo properly, while others have failed to get guidance.
I just did a little Google search, actually. I was like Māori language consultant, and there they are. They pop up all over the place. So I don't see why we should be having these issues.
The Wellington store says the Intellectual Property Officers Māori Advisory Committee considered the name before it was approved as a trademark and did not find it was culturally inappropriate or insensitive to Māori. 4 flood protection schemes in Hawke's Bay will receive more than $19 million in government funding. The money has come from the government's $3 billion COVID-19 infrastructure fund, and the projects will create up to 63 jobs in the region. It's 4 minutes past 6. An independent investigation will be carried out into allegations of abuse within New Zealand Gymnastics. A raft of allegations have emerged over the past week about an abusive culture in the sport, and Gymnastics New Zealand has now commissioned the former head of the World Anti-Doping Agency, David Helen, to carry out what it says will be a wide-ranging and unfettered review of the sport. Felicity Reid reports.
Gymnastics New Zealand Chief Executive Tony Compier says the allegations, both current and historic, are distressing, and the organisation deeply regrets and apologises for any harm caused. Compier says recent revelations don't just contain specific experiences of abuse, but also concerns about the wider culture of gymnastics, and David Helen will have unlimited score to review any aspect of the sport. The terms of reference and a timeframe for the report are now being finalised. This is Felicity Reid.
Automatic qualification for the A-League football semi-finals hangs in the balance for the Wellington Phoenix. They need to beat Brisbane tonight if they retain any hope of finishing in the top 2 and progressing to the semis rather than having to go through the rather more circuitous playoff route. They are currently third at 3 points behind Melbourne City with 2 games remaining. The White Ferns captain Sophie Devine will play for the Perth Scorchers in the WBBL T20 competition. Devine was the WBBL's player of the tournament last season, averaging 77 for the Adelaide Strikers and clubbing a record 29 sixes, the most recorded in one season in both the men's and women's leagues. That's the news.
Take the pulse of the day's news every weeknight at 10.
It's not very pleasant to have something stuck up your nose, but it's the best test that we have got available to us.
Live with local, national and international stories as they happen.
In this toilet will be used while the crew is in the spacecraft. It's not as simple as just, plopping your butt on the toilet and going to the bathroom.
Lately with Karen Hay every weeknight from 10 on RNZ National.
Now the short forecast from Met Service to midnight tomorrow. Northland a few showers turning to rain tomorrow night. Auckland to Taranaki, also Coromandel, Bay of Plenty and Taupo. Mainly fine tonight. The odd shower about Auckland and Coromandel. Scattered showers tomorrow and late rain in the west. Whanganui and Taihape to Wellington, also Gisborne to Wairarapa. Fine apart from a few cloudy areas. Late showers about Kapiti and Wellington tomorrow. For Nelson, Bulla, Westland and Fiordland, scattered rain developing tonight. Periods of rain tomorrow, heavy at times. Marlborough, fine apart from scattered rain tomorrow evening. Canterbury, North Otago and Dunedin, low cloud about the coast and plains, clearing tomorrow morning. Otherwise fine, then high cloud tomorrow with scattered rain in the evening. Central Otago, Clutha and Southland, cloudy at times, patchy rain tomorrow. And Chatham Islands, cloudy periods and the odd shower. RNZ National, almost 7 minutes past 6.
Thanks, Susanna. Welcome back to Checkpoint. If you're watching us on Freeview Channel 50 and Sky Channel 83, these are live pictures from Reuters from Beirut. Right now, it's about 9 o'clock in the morning and the port resembles a war zone or bomb site. Much of what we can see as the site still smoulders is what remains of buildings and containers at the seaport, where helicopters have spent much of the night and morning putting out fires. We can see roofs have been blown off there and bits of wood scattered and buildings just totally collapsed. It was an explosion so massive it registered on the Richter scale, the measure used to quantify the force of earthquakes. In news just to hand, the death toll has now risen to 100 and at least 4,000 people are injured. As we go to air, rescuers are still searching for survivors amongst the rubble of fallen buildings. It is believed thousands of tonnes of ammonium nitrate, which had been stored at a warehouse at this port, exploded, ripping through nearby residential neighbourhoods, flattening buildings, tossing cars into the air and shattering glass for kilometres. We can see smoke in the live picture still wafting away from that site, which indeed does look like a bomb has hit. An initial smaller explosion explosion appears to have drawn curious onlookers closer to the site before the second catastrophic blast. Middle East correspondent for The Independent, Belle True, lives in Beirut. I spoke to her a little earlier and she described what happened in the city that is already reeling from an economic crisis and a surge in coronavirus cases.
There was the initial first explosion in the port area where people were basically showing videos of large cloud coming out by the sort of seafronts with what looked like some kind of maybe fireworks going off in the middle of it. And a lot of people actually ended up sort of basically walking closer towards the explosion, trying to work out what was going on. And then there was, shortly after that, an enormous explosion, something that I have never heard. And I've been covering conflict and wars and suicide bombings for a decade now. This was an explosion of a magnitude that I've never witnessed before. It was so huge. I was actually just outside of Beirut at the time, and it still knocked me to my knees up on the mountainside. Looking at the footage taken by people that was basically right next to it, the shock waves rolled throughout the city, shattering everything in its path, ripping up parts of the streets, obviously destroying any of the buildings immediately in the surrounding of this epicenter, but also causing damage up to sort of 15k away from the center of the blast. Now, what caused it, we haven't quite got a full confirmation yet from the Lebanese authorities. Of course, people at the beginning were concerned that this might have been an attack, that this might have been actually the start of a war because of tensions rising between basically Hezbollah here in Lebanon and Israel. But from what we can tell from what the security forces have been saying and what the Lebanese authorities have been saying, is it looks like there may have been a small explosion that was the first one in a fireworks depot, perhaps, which then ignited maybe up to 2,700 tons of ammonium nitrate, which is what caused that extraordinary blast that wreaked so much havoc across the city.
I want to talk more about the cause in a little bit, but in terms of the explosion, some people have likened it to an earthquake. Is there any measure of the magnitude of it?
Well, we're still trying to get confirmation on that yet, but it was, according to Germany's Geosciences Centre, GFZ, it was struck with the force of a 3.5 magnitude earthquake. So we are really talking about something that felt like an earthquake. Like the ground was moving, the explosions were huge, people's windows were blown out. I mean, in my own flat, which is about a kilometre from the epicenter of the blast, we're not just talking about blown out windows and doors being blown open. We're talking about my windows, which have steel or at least metal frames and steel electric shutters being ripped out from the wall and thrown across the room. That was the level of the sort of strength of the blast. Some buildings came to the ground, and sort of other buildings had, their balconies ripped off. So, I mean, as I said, we're talking about something that could be likened to an earthquake, with the combined factor of these shock waves basically ripping open holes in buildings in the vicinity.
And so a large number of people injured and also killed. What kind of injuries did people sustain? And also, how did the hospitals cope here?
Well, it was quite staggering. So I made my way to the hospitals in my local area, which was one of the worst hit places because of it's very, very close, as I said, to the epicenter of the blast. And the hospitals themselves were hit. So my local hospital, I mean, the inside of the emergency department was basically rubble. The staff who had survived were trying to pull out wounded and injured medics as well as patients. I spoke to one hospital orderly who was just 21 years old who had gone to the ICU unit and said that there were people on ventilators pinned underneath doors, bits of building, masonry, windows. So they were trying to struggle with that from inside the hospitals whilst there were injuries flooding in from all around the area. So they had to set up a kind of makeshift, basically, emergency room in the hospital car park, which until the blast was actually hosting the drive-through coronavirus main testing facility in this area. They also had, of course, coronavirus patients that they tried to separate from those being injured. It was absolute chaos because you had the hospitals themselves suffering from the blast. You know, the staff members trying to get out of the rubble, trying to pull patients from without the rubble, trying to deal with patients flooding in from the surrounding area. There was, of course, no power. I mean, Lebanon's been suffering from massive power outages anyway over the last few weeks. But any generators that were operating, some of them were hit by the blast. So they were literally tending to patients using their mobile phone lights in the car park of what was a drive-through coronavirus facility testing area, with coronavirus patients that were being evacuated from inside the rubble of the hospitals. And it was really staggering what people were trying to do with basically no resources amid just piles of shattered glass, fallen masonry, twisted metal, and just trying to deal with an extraordinary number of wounded, which numbered in their thousands.
Belle, I know you've had very little sleep and you were up very late. I just wondered, what's the state of the situation with emergency services? Are they going through rubble? Is it anticipated that there are any survivors to be found, or what's happening at the site now?
Well, at the moment, the death toll of right now as I'm speaking to you is 78 dead and nearly 4,000 injured. There are lots and lots of missing people. So actually someone has set up an Instagram account that is basically collating all the tweets and pleas for help with photographs of those who are missing to try and find them, because we don't know whether they're just injured and not properly documented in hospitals, or whether they're still under the rubble, or whether they've just been eviscerated because the blast was so huge, especially those port workers who were working very close to the warehouse that was hit. So at the moment, you know, I imagine they will still be trying to pull people out from underneath the destroyed rubble in the immediate vicinity. They will also be trying to identify bodies in morgues and those who are in critical care in the various different hospitals across the country, because the hospitals in Beirut were overwhelmed pretty quickly. The Lebanese Red Cross was saying they were taking people as far as Tripoli, which is, you know, a few hours drive north of Beirut. And at the same time, as I said, people being treated in the car parks of the hospitals, which were basically left, you know, pretty destroyed. So I think today is going to be a horrible day of people whose loved ones are missing, trying to find out what happened to them. At the same time, as the security services still digging through what it remains of Beirut port, whilst dealing with just sort of multitude of disasters at the same time.
You've talked about the potential cause, this store of ammonium nitrate. Who is responsible for having left it there for a number of years, and what's happening about that?
Well, that I think is going to be the million-dollar question here for the Lebanese people, who have really been through hell over the last few months. I mean, I've witnessed this country come to its knees because of a financial collapse that is rooted in corruption and decades of mismanagement, that has seen almost hyperinflation, food prices double, sometimes triple, the currency collapse, as well as these massive power outages because of fuel shortages. There was already quite a lot of anger directed at the officials and the government for not handling the country properly now. Right now, an investigation is underway. The Lebanese Prime Minister and Lebanese President have separately all said that those who are responsible be held to account. But given the state of the country, given the fact that mismanagement and corruption has been behind so many of Lebanon's woes, I wouldn't be surprised if that was the reason why this warehouse of explosives was allowed to just basically sit there like a ticking bomb.
And that was Middle East correspondent for The Independent, Belle True, speaking from Beirut. And since I spoke to her earlier, the death toll has now been revised upwards to 100. It is 18 minutes past 6 and you're with Checkpoint on RNZ National. The Director General of Health, Dr. Ashley Bloomfield, says community transmission of COVID-19 in the country is inevitable, but the Health Minister isn't as convinced. Chris Hipkins wouldn't use that word to describe how likely community transmission is and wasn't prepared to even put a likelihood on it.
That's very speculative. We will do everything we can to keep COVID-19 out. But the Prime Minister and I have both been saying for a long time now that we need to be prepared. We can never take anything for granted, while we'll do everything we can to keep COVID-19 out of New Zealand.
And Dr Bluefield told Morning Report it's a matter of when, not if, New Zealand got community transmission. Mr Hipkins says preparedness is important. In the same way the country prepares for earthquakes, it should also get ready for a potential second wave. Some, including former Air New Zealand Chief Executive Rob Fyfe, have questioned the country's ability to contact trace if community transmission was to break out in New Zealand. Mr Hipkins says no matter how good the system is, there's always going to be risks, but he rejects that the Contact Tracer app is ineffective.
There are a number of different people out there who all have a perfect solution. There is no such thing as a perfect solution, and so we have to draw on all the tools that we've got available to us around contact tracing.
Anyone who goes to get COVID tested no longer has to self-isolate while they wait for their result, unless they meet the criteria set out by the Ministry of Health under the higher index of suspicion. But RNZ understands some clinics are still instructing everyone who is tested to self-isolate. Mr Hipkins says that shouldn't be happening, and he'd follow up on the reports.
The guidance is very clear. You only need to isolate after you've had a test if you are in that higher risk group.
He says communication from the top doesn't filter to everyone.
I think one of the challenges is that we are working with a number of small and private businesses, and whilst we can push messages out, we do rely on them picking those messages up.
The contact tracing capacity hasn't yet been stretched to its full capacity, but Mr Hipkins says stress testing has and still is taking place. New Zealanders flying into the country for a short trip home can now be charged for their stay in managed isolation. But the actual regime won't come into place until at least next week. Here's our Deputy Political Editor, Craig McCulloch.
For months, the government's been mulling whether to charge for managed isolation hotels. The governing parties all on different pages. New Zealand First in favour, the Greens against. It was only last week an announcement was made, and even then, a reluctant one.
This again outlines the shambolic nature of this government.
The opposition's position on this issue is totally shambolic.
Don't lecture us about shambolic and disorganised when the three parties across the House can't even get their stuff together.
The contentious issue finally reaching the debating chamber this week, and while it may have taken a while to get there, the legislation moved fast on arrival. Parliament sat under urgency to push it into law, the usual months-long process condensed into roughly 3 hours.
The proposed charging system seeks to strike the right balance between being fair to arrivals and not preventing New Zealanders from wanting to return home.
The new law creates a framework which allows the government to charge for isolation. And here's what the government has agreed on. A New Zealander who leaves the country for a holiday or business trip will be charged roughly $3,000 on return. The same too for those already overseas who come home for fewer than 90 days, with some exceptions. The Minister responsible, Megan Woods, says those who come back permanently won't have to pay.
Each and every one of us want to know that wherever we are in the world, there will not be impediments for us returning to the safety of Aotearoa, New Zealand.
The National Party says the plan is weak, that it should apply to nearly everybody coming home. It says the mild approach is a vote grab.
So shore up the London vote, Mr Speaker. If you want to come home, don't worry, we'll get you all these exceptions, all these exemptions, you won't have to pay.
It says Kiwis abroad were given fair warning to come home.
New Zealanders overseas who want to return had actually plenty of time.
It says ultimately it's not fair to pile the cost of isolation on taxpayers alone.
We're talking at over $1 billion for managed isolation. And we all know that it's going to be more than 1 year that this goes on for.
Despite that, the opposition party voted for the legislation. It says if re-elected, it would use the new framework to implement its own more extensive regime. Just Jamie Lee Ross and ex-David Seymour voted against. The government has to introduce further regulations before the charging can start. It plans to do so on Monday next week. From Parliament for Checkpoint, Craig McCulloch.
The National Party says it will solve Wellington's transport problems and dig a second Mount Victoria tunnel. The party has announced a $4 billion package for Wellington and the Hutt Valley as part of its wider $31 billion transport infrastructure program. But Labour is hitting back at the election policy. Here's our political reporter, Charlie Drever.
National MPs are hitting the campaign trail. and sticking to the same track. In Auckland, the party is pledging to dig a tunnel under the harbour. And today in Wellington, leader Judith Collins sets her sights on a second Mount Victoria tunnel.
We need more. I love this. I mean, tunnels, yes, excellent.
It also wants a second terrace tunnel and would underground State Highway 1 through Te Aro. On top of that, it has promised rapid transport between the airport and the Wellington CBD via buses or trackless trams, and a new highway connecting Seaview and Lower Hutt to the north of Wellington. Nationals leader Judith Collins says transport is the number one problem facing the region and is confident the party's 20-year plan will fix it.
Wellington has the worst traffic in Australasia for a city under 1 million people. Wellingtonians spend more time sitting in traffic than people from Brisbane, a city 5 times its size, and that is a disgrace.
Currently, transport governance is shared between city and regional councils. Nationals Transport spokesperson Chris Bishop says the party plans to change that by creating a new Wellington Transport Agency.
Transport in Wellington has been a debacle for far too long. We only have to look at the lasagna of failure 2 years ago with the buses in Wellington that Nicola in particular did a lot of work on to know that. We had them before the select committee, the regional council turned up and blamed the city council, then the city council turned up and they blamed the regional council.
Labour's transport spokesperson Phil Twyford agreed a new agency could be a good idea if the councils agreed. But he wasn't having a bite of the lasagna claim, instead serving this up to National.
I would say the National Party cooked that lasagna. The bus catastrophe that happened over the last couple of years was a direct result of the PTOM, the Public Transport Operating Framework, that National legislated, and we'll be fixing it.
He also questioned how the National Party will pay for an extra $31 billion in its infrastructure program, on top of what Labor has already committed to.
They've promised to cut transport revenue by $3 billion, and they're not telling Kiwis how they're going to fund these massive promises. What projects are they going to cut?
Phil Twyford says Labor is committed to a second Victoria tunnel. However, it had previously pushed back construction to 2029. Mr Twyford said a second terrace tunnel is not a priority. From Parliament, for Checkpoint, ko Charlie Drever, DNA.
Outgoing Sport New Zealand Chief Executive Peter Miskimen says there's been a win-at-all-costs mentality in the country and it's time to strike a better balance. Miskimen has today announced he is resigning as CEO after 12 years in the job. In his role, he has overseen both high performance and community sport and told sports editor Stephen Hewson there are a number of challenges the sector still needs to tackle.
We've got issues of how do we get more kids playing, how do we give them a quality experience so they stay longer. We only have to talk about the gymnastics situation right now. You know, that plays out a lot. Those issues are still with us. How do we get volunteers? How do we get good quality coaches in the system? So many of those issues that we have now are, teenage drop-off. But equally, there's a whole lot of other things that have changed quite dramatically. You know, I think our high-performance system is a really good example of that. You know, the changes that we made, the step change we did around 2012, and we established High Performance Sport New Zealand, which has gone on to fuel the success we've had in Olympic and Paralympic.
Do you sense the pendulum, though, has swung too far and there's too much emphasis on winning?
I do. I think for a period of time it was win at all costs. The desire to want to put more medals on a medal tally. And that's not to say that winning isn't important. It is, because it does inspire people. But it is a balance of that and making sure that we are using that in a way that inspires others and impacts others positively.
Sport too seems to be struggling to where its place in society is and its duty of care, I suppose. You mentioned the gymnastics situation, but there's been several sports that have had similar problems. How is sport going to cope with that and come to terms with it and I suppose come to an understanding that they need to have that duty of care?
Look, I think that's absolutely right. We're a value-based movement, if you like. Sport is for good, and it also has a bad side. It can have a bad side. But I think that reflects all of society. Harm is one issue, but equally their enjoyment is the other. If we're not creating that environment, then they're not going to continue on to be healthy and active, and that's really critical. I think our sports sectors, sport organisations are aware. I think they are very much aware that behaviour of the past is no longer acceptable today, and that they do need more systems and processes and education around that. You know, it is such a force for good sport, but every now and then it does have these circumstances where, you know, the over-enthusiastic behaviours of adults mar the experience or do not keep kids safe, and that's a real worry.
And that's Sport New Zealand Chief Executive Peter Miskimmin, who'll finish up in the role in December. A lot of you have been getting in touch about this call for an investigation into supermarkets. And this one kind of reflects what a lot of you are saying. Supermarkets have been making a fortune for far too long at the expense of the people who can least afford it. If you can afford the basics, your nutrition suffers and your health, then as a country, we all pay. Making a profit is part of a sound business model. Gouging the market is another thing. David's got in touch to say, I'm old enough to remember big discussions years ago re-regulating the number of major players in that market. And the conclusion was that two chains would keep each other honest. Of course, trust us. Yeah, right, says David. Nick says, until we make cartels in New Zealand illegal, supermarkets will continue to exploit the system. Paul says, capitalism only works when there is competition. The supermarkets are a duopoly, which is why so many people want Aldi to come to New Zealand. The duopoly are bound to resist any investigation, says Paul. On the foreign students, most of you are saying, nah, don't bring them in just yet. Amy says it takes only one careless mistake to undo our sacrifice. Last word goes to Sparky on jobs. Sparky here, heaps of work, get a trade. Whenever I hear the name Sparky, I think right front wheel.
Sparky in the talking train. RNZ News headlines at 6:30. Kiwibank's chief economist says the latest unemployment figure of 4% is not worth the paper it's written on. The death toll from a massive explosion that rocked Beirut has reached 100, and the Lebanese Red Cross says more victims are under the rubble. An independent investigation will be carried out into allegations of abuse within New Zealand Gymnastics. And 4 flood protection schemes in Hawke's Bay will receive government funding of more than $19 million for projects that will create up to 63 jobs in the region. Those are the headlines. Our next news will be at 7, and then...
Tonight on Nights, episode 3 of the story of Apollo 13, which never made it to the moon. But if it wasn't for the lunar lander, would never have made it back to Earth either. Andy Burt talks about facing the haka, looking at the All Black Challenge from the other side. And we've got a sofa session with restaurateurs turned